We are diving in. This is week 2 of our series called She Has Words. If you'll recall, this is a series about women who speak in the Bible that spawns from this book, Bible Women, All Their Words and Why They Matter. I realized this week when I was in Duluth and forgot this book in my office and I was trying to prep for this, so I bought the Kindle version, that she has updated this. And the Kindle version has more stuff in it. So if you're interested in this book, I might recommend the Kindle version because it's newer and she's got some other, anyways. But it's a great little resource about the women who have words in the Bible, which is, there's more than you maybe think, but it's still very few percentage-wise. And so I'm pulling out a few of them. Last week we began this series by looking at Eve and her words and her and why she matters. This week we're going to look at two women who kind of speak together, named Shiphrah and Puah. Everybody say Shiphrah and Puah. Yeah, there you go. So let me notes out here so I don't just ramble on forever. Where this story picks up is a very key moment in the biblical narrative. You might recall all of this from our journey through the narrative lectionary last fall. Basically what happens is, Joseph and his big coat and all of that stuff. You remember that story? At the end of the musical, Joseph ends up in Egypt, and the family comes down there as well, and they essentially settle in Egypt. And why that's important is that from there, then we get this nation that God had promised to Joseph's grandfather Abraham begins to happen, and you end up with many Israelites in Egypt. And what happens then is Pharaoh gets nervous about this rising immigrant population in his midst taking over. It's like the original replacement theory stuff. I'll just leave it at that. And then Pharaoh begins to find ways to to pat down this Israelite population. And we get one of those tactics that Pharaoh uses in our story today to try to snuff out the Israelites. And so with that, I'm going to invite William to come forward to read our passage today, which was tricky to select because it's kind of a long story, so we just got kind of part of it. But so here we go.
The king of Egypt, can you hear me? Yep. Yeah, okay. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was called Shiphrah and the other Puah, "When you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live." But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives, and said to them, "Why have you done this, and allowed the boys to live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them." So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. Because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, "Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live."
The gospel of Jesus Christ, ladies and gentlemen. It's a terrible story. We talked about this last fall in a sermon I titled "Empire." The Empire Always Strikes Back. But it is a terrible, terrible story. But there's also this beauty in it. There's also this power in this story, and that is this: that you have to remember the role of a midwife is to do what? It is to bring about life, right? It is to bring life into the world, not death. And that's what Shiphrah and Puah knew about themselves, and knew about their faith, and knew about their work. And that's what they were focused on. Pharaoh be damned. There's a strong thread in Judaism that when it comes down to it, the thing that brings about life, the thing that guards life, the thing that protects life, is the right thing to do. I remember this, maybe I've shared this story, but it became very acute to me during COVID, as I was good friends with a rabbi in St. Louis Park at a conservative synagogue. Conservative synagogue does not mean politically conservative. It's like an actual kind of denomination of Judaism. But they tend to stick pretty strictly to a lot of the Torah laws, and particularly around Sabbath. Which means in this synagogue, they would have to turn on the lights in the synagogue before Shabbat started, because you can't even turn on the lights in the synagogue. They would start their live stream before Shabbat started, because you can't fire up the camera and all of that. Everything had, they're very, very strict. When I went to preach there once, they invited me to preach, which was a great honor. I often have a pen on my Bible, right? And one of the other rabbis came up and very politely asked me to put my pen away because it's a tool that you don't use on Shabbat. I was like, woo, okay. So very strict. So what happens when all of a sudden a pandemic falls upon our nation and this world, and the governor is saying, don't gather? How do you follow Shabbat when you can't physically come together in a space? You can't do it because you can't be on Zoom like we were able to be on Zoom during the pandemic. But what this synagogue decided was, what is the thing that will bring life to this situation? It is not gathering, right? Because in that space, gathering could very well bring about death. And so the right thing to do is to violate Shabbat laws by doing our Shabbat services on Zoom. And it was just a really powerful thing. Talking to my rabbi friend about this, we actually had we co-wrote an op-ed in the I can't remember what publication it was, but about just the way in which our faith was informing how we were moving through this space, because what matters is life. This is an intentional effort. But what's going on, I'm sorry, I skipped something. What's going on in this story here is not a pandemic. I mean, later there's going to be some plagues, but at this moment, this is not a pandemic. This is actually an intentional effort by a maniacal ruler to take life away because he perceives certain lives to be a threat to his power. I'm going to say that again. What's going on in this story is an intentional effort by a maniacal ruler to take away life because he perceives certain lives to be a threat to his power. There is a way in which the easy thing to do here would be to just obey the decree, because the Pharaoh has all the power. The Pharaoh has the strength, and if you don't obey his decree, you might end up not alive. But there's also a way in which the most impossible thing to do would be to obey the decree. There's no way you could obey this decree. How could midwives take the very lives of those they are called to deliver into the world? They can't do that. It's not in their bones. Or at least two of them couldn't do that, and that was Shiphrah and Puah. I'm sure there were more. When Pharaoh summons them in regards to them not following his decree, not obeying his commands, well, Shiphrah and Puah have words. It's kind of strange words in some ways. It says, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them, is their reply as to why they're not going to do this. It's a little bit cryptic, but and with these words, there's a strange comparison to the Egyptian women. You have to understand one of the things they're dealing with here is like they can't just say to the Pharaoh, well, we're not going to follow your orders because you're an idiot. Like, we're not going to follow your orders because you're crazy and you're weak and you're scared. We're not going to follow it. They have to kind of dance around it a little bit, but they do speak truth to power ultimately, which is to say that we will not bow down to what the king says, but what our God says. We are going to do what we know to be right and good. That's what this is. That's what they're saying. Shiphrah and Puah were not just midwives to children. They were midwives to what is right and good. They were midwives to justice. They recognized that they came from a tradition bigger than their political climate. And even though that political climate, that political structure seemed really, really big, they recognized that they came from something bigger. I think that's important for us to remember in this moment, in these days. That though this nation that we live in, this political climate that we live in seems to be all-encompassing, it's not. We belong to something more. We belong to something bigger than this. This is not nearly at the same scale, but this story reminds me a little bit of when our current president threatened to withhold federal funding to the state of Maine if they didn't do the ban on trans males in sports. And they were in a meeting with the governors, and Maine's governor was able to say directly to our president, "We'll see you in court." That's a gutsy moment to do. It's easy for me to say that on Facebook. It's easy for me to write in a little commentary to the Minnesota Tribune about it. But would I have the courage to say it directly to him? I don't know. I'd have to see if I ever had that moment. Kind of hope I don't. I don't want to be with him. Sorry, I'm getting really political here today, but this is important. And I deeply respect Maine's governor for being able to say that, to stand up in that way, to say those lives matter, and I will not let you use them as a political cudgel. It's rare that you get the opportunity to speak truth directly to power like that. And again, the question is, do I have the clarity of mind to know when to do it and about what? And I think that's one of the big takeaways from Shiphrah and Puah, is that they had that clarity. They knew exactly who they were, what they stood for, what they knew to be right. And in that moment, because they had that clarity, they were able to stand up and say, "No, we will not do as you have commanded." They went back to their community. See, they didn't just speak truth to power. They then went back to their community, and they did the work necessary to protect their community. And that's what it's always about, beloved. Watching out for our community. Feels like a good Pride Weekend message. 56 years ago yesterday, was the first Pride Parade. Except it wasn't a parade. It was a riot. It was a riot of LGBTQ folks at the Stonewall Inn in Manhattan standing up to defend themselves, to fight for themselves, because in some ways that nobody else was. Yes, there were some people that were working and fighting for them the best they could, but ultimately they were just trying to exist, and the system around them was trying to wipe them out of existence, to say, "No, we know who you are more than you know who you are." A year later, to commemorate what happened at the Stonewall Inn in 1969, June 28th, it was 1970, June 28th, that they gathered again at the Stonewall Inn, and they marched from the Stonewall Inn to Central Park, which was essentially your first real Pride Parade, a celebration of who we are, a standing up in the midst of great risk to say, "This is who we are, deal with it." Today, in just a few minutes, the Pride Parade will take place in Loring Park to commemorate this and to celebrate people simply being who they are. Because here's what I believe to be true, beloved. There's a maniacal ruler who perceives certain lives to be a threat to his power, and therefore he feels he needs to wipe them out of existence. That is a very real thing that is happening in our culture around LGBTQ people, particularly trans folks today. There's a whole movement to erase them. To erase my son. And by God, I will not stand for it. We need to fight against this with everything that we have. Too much progress for LGBTQ people has been made over the decades for us to jump this far backwards. And so I say today, on this Pride Sunday, on this second week of this series, thank you, Shiphrah and Puah, for being a model for us of courage to stand up against frightening, terrifying power to do what is right and good. That is our call today in this moment. Beloved, we are calling all Shiphrahs and Puahs. Let us pray.